I knocked on the door, and she looked at me like I was a stranger. The first line is always the one that ruins you or saves you. That morning it ruined me. She stood there, my daughter, her hair perfectly set, her designer coat buttoned to the throat, while the house behind her smelled of polished wood and something I could not name, a scent paid for by other people's work. The maid's eyes were polite and quick. The security camera above the foyer blinked like a small, indifferent star. I held my mason jar in both hands because I had brought it with me, as I always did, 3 crumpled notes and a handful of coins that sat in that jar like little prayers. It was a ridiculous thing to carry, perhaps, for someone invited to her daughter's family brunch. But when you have lived long enough, you learn that habits are lifelines. My chipped mug was wrapped in a tea towel in my bag. In it, I had tucked the old pearls, my mother's, out of habit, as if the weight of them would anchor me to the woman I once was. She said, "Mother, we didn't expect you today." Her voice was the kind that arranges furniture with words, soft, efficient, tilted to avoid feeling. She smiled in a way that I had once taught her to smile at school plays and at ledger entries. There was a brief silence long enough for me to remember the nights I had kept her warm as she coughed, the neighbors' debts I'd paid with coins from that same mason jar, the stories I had told her when storms came and the lights went out. Would those nights count for anything now? I could feel my fingers tighten on the glass. The mansion felt as cold as the winter mornings when we couldn't afford firewood. Portraits on the walls watched me, painted faces frozen, as if even the oil had decided to side with her. I was almost charmed by the absurdity of it, me with my chipped mug and my pearls, in a house that had seen wedding planners and corporate donors, until a woman in a navy suit slid a glossy envelope across the marble desk like a verdict. A woman who introduced herself as Ms. Rafiq Family Counsel did not say the words I feared, but she didn't need to. The envelope had my name written on it in a hand I recognized too well, precise, careful, my daughter's. I felt something closing inside me then, like a door I had always expected to stay open. It was not the first strange thing that day. Earlier, the neighbor's son, whom I'd known since he was a boy, had called to ask if I was all right because he had seen me going into my daughter's building like some rusted key returned to a lock. I laughed and told him not to be silly. I put the mason jar on my bed that night and practiced saying, "I am all right," until the sentence felt true. But the envelope on the marble could not be made true by practice. There were papers inside, neatly stacked, legal, dry as old bread. Among them, as if planted and waiting for my faltering hands, was something named Durable Power of Attorney, stamped April 3rd, 2 days before the charity gala. I froze for a second. I had heard of such things, but never thought they would ever matter to me. A durable power of attorney, Ms. Rafiq explained, with the soft efficiency of a woman who handles other people's misfortunes for a living, gives the attorney, in fact, the authority to manage financial affairs. The document bore a date, a signature, and a seal. The signature looked like my daughter's. It looked like the looped handwriting I had taught her to use when she was small, the one she used on birthday cards. But handwriting can be taught and copied. I fingered the edge of the envelope and felt the slickness of betrayal like wet paper. I was not naive. I had watched my daughter climb, metaphorically and then literally, out of the modest life I had given her. She had married a man with bright shoes and a charitable name. She had taken positions that placed her on stages, and she had learned to speak in the measured cadence of boardrooms. Money had come like tidewater, covering the small things we once knew. Her home now gleamed with the evidence of new tastes, a silver tea service I remembered from a magazine, a Persian rug that ate my sensible shoes with softness. But we had known warmth once. Laughter bent around the kitchen table. My chipped mug filled the way it always had, and that warmth made the sight of a stamped, dated document feel like a theft. The exposition I give next is the kind of slow, careful laying out of life that one learns to do when nights get long. I was a woman who had, at 40, put aside her own ambitions to raise a child who had become the world. I was a woman who mended shirts in the evenings and hid the better aprons from visiting sisters because pride was a complicated thing. I had kept the mason jar not as savings for anything grand, but as small change against the day the heater sputtered or the cat needed medicine. The pearls, my mother's, were a talisman for the dignity that lived inside me like a stubborn ember. The chipped mug had a hairline crack where my son once dropped it, and I had glued it back with a patience honed by poverty and love. I remember the ordinary world with clarity. Mornings where I swept the small rug and made tea at 6:15 a.m. The smell of coriander on Thursdays, the way the sun slipped through my kitchen window like an apology. My daughter would call, sometimes brief, sometimes long. She would send photographs of lunches she did not tell me about and of the charity galas where she stood beside men who gave checks in theatrics. I did not resent her. Love does not behave like a ledger. It accumulates, it forgives, it forgets things it should not, like paper in a drawer. But the status quo cracked slowly, a sharp sound you only notice once the whole house has come down. I am telling you these small things because small things matter. A mason jar becomes a symbol of sacrifice. A strand of pearls becomes a promise. I plant them now like breadcrumbs because when I later pick them up, they will lead to a truth that will singe the palms of those who touched it. I am not a woman who tells stories to be admired. I tell stories because, like a map, they show where to go when you have been lost. The first betrayal was a silence. I arrived for what was meant to be a family brunch and was shown to a room where the wallpaper was a poem about impartiality. Laughter drifted down the corridor like a bird that could be shooed away. My daughter sat at the head of a table set for many. Her husband was at her right, his watch a bright question. She did not stand. She poured conversation into a careful tray of words and steered it elsewhere when my name was suggested. She excused herself for a phone call. She told me, later, after a series of explanations and a politely refracted apology, that the seating had been arranged for the foundation donors and the room was crowded beyond a fault. A minor thing, she said. Coincidence, she called it. But exclusion is not accidental. It is arranged like a table. I noticed then the small shifts, invitations that arrived late, calls that were answered with busy holiday photographs where I was cropped to a corner I had not noticed until the picture was framed and placed on a mantel. I gave her the benefit of every doubt because I had always been generous of heart and because mothers have a way of hoping that their children do not betray them. But hope is not a plan. A woman who survives long winters learns to read weather in the clouds. I began to read indifference in her eyes. The early rising action gathered like storm water, whispers in hallways, a neighbor who said, "Did you hear?" and then would not finish the sentence. A letter left on my doorstep with no return address, a bank letter that arrived at the wrong house and told me that an account had been closed. Little things piled like splinters. I began to notice a pattern, the kind of pattern that does not announce itself. It simply is like mildew in a damp closet. I went to see the bank, and the clerk, kind with a slow voice, told me that a form had been filed on April 3rd, authorizing a transfer of my services to a third party. The words blurred. The clerk used the phrase, durable power of attorney again. I felt the phrase like an icicle on my shoulder. I asked for copies. The bank required identification and a signature. The clerk asked me politely if I was certain I was the person named on the account. I laughed then, a small bark, because the idea that I, an old woman with a chipped mug and a mason jar, could be erased by paper felt. Comical and absurd, I never expected. What I found in that drawer. When I opened the drawer, in my small flat, that drawer where I kept letters to myself, recipes my mother wrote, and a photograph of my daughter at 5 with soup on her chin, I did not expect to find a thin stack of paper with my name on the top. The topmost sheet was a photocopy, a pale, precise thing. There was a note taped to it. "For your records, Ma." The handwriting was hers. The photocopy, I realize now, was meant for someone else's eyes and placed because a conscience flickered for a moment before being stamped out. The photocopied page bore the language of authority. Effective April 3rd, 2025. The undersigned appoints. The date was close, 2 days before the gala, and my breath caught because dates, like little clocks, make consequences inevitable. I began to press the threads. I asked questions, a dangerous pastime when people prefer to live as if certain facts are invisible. My daughter's answers were punctual and precise. "It's standard," she said. "I'm helping with the paperwork for easier management." She spoke of efficiency and simplifying future decisions. Her husband's smile was taut. He did not meet my eyes. An aunt I had not seen in years came for tea and said, "People change. Priorities change." When a cousin, tired, with a wallet fuller than mine, said, "It's the modern world," I wanted to smash the teacup on the table. But I held the chipped mug and drank because shock needs a steady hand. The micro-betrayals multiplied. A neighbor told me, in the manner of someone relaying gossip at the post office, that a trust had been established. There were meetings I was not invited to and contractors who never returned calls when I asked about our house. The house, the one I had, believed would always be a shelter, was suddenly described in terms I did not understand. Equity lines, trustees, management firms. My world, the one bound by recipes and cardigan sleeves, was being translated into legalese. In those moments, you see how language can be used like a blade. You can cut a person out of their life by renaming it. There were moments of near-comic cruelty, late evening phone calls that were disconnected, a birthday card that arrived with only a printed signature, a brief text message that read, "Sorry, Ma, things are complicated." Complicated, a word that slickly hides intent. I began to sleep less. The sleeping pills I had taken for 20 years, simple tablets prescribed to soothe the nights after men had left and children had fallen ill, became my island. I took them because they dulled the ache. I took them because they made mornings tolerable. I did not realize then that they had been a soft shroud that muffled the world's sounds. As things escalated, I found in them not only relief, but a dangerous dullness. Nights were comfortable, but days were where the hurt lived. I would press my head to the pillow and wonder who had permission to remove me from my own story. One afternoon, someone, who I now know was a neighbor of my daughter's, left a folded letter at my door. It was written on paper that smelled faintly of the perfume she wore at charity events. The letter did not bear a signature, but it bore facts, dates, times, names, and an amount, about $230,000, transferred to an account I had never known existed. I read the numbers as if they were a foreign currency. The amount was not a fortune in some economies, but I had lived my life in a different ledger. For me, $230,000 was a house, a lifetime of small comforts multiplied into something safe. That letter began to rearrange the furniture of my life. I called the neighbor, and his voice was small when he answered. "I thought you should know," he said. I saw it on a public record. Public records, such a specific phrase, are like glass. What they show cannot be unseen. I tried to find the comfort of denial, but it slipped like water. I am not a woman given to melodrama. I am a woman who counts things, days, pills, coins, promises. The list of things that had shifted without my consent grew like a shadow in my hallway. I kept my pearls in my pocket that night and slept with the mason jar under the bed as if coins could hold off the dark. A child I once babysat, now a young man with a small scar above his eye, came to the door with news that turned my stomach. He had worked one summer at the law firm that handled my daughter's affairs and had seen the name of a trustee listed as H. Con Investments. "They're consolidating assets," he said. It seemed standard. His face was full of the kind of guilt that cannot be apologized away. I listened and folded my hands until my knuckles ached. The simple measures of hospitality seemed like armor I could not afford. The rising action was no longer a rumor, it was a visible thing, stacking itself with the slow inevitability of a tide. I never expected the next thing. 2 days before the gala, April 3rd, 2025, a date that I can now say out loud and feel the pressure of like a bruise. I stood outside my daughter's office building with my mason jar in my pocket and the pearls around my throat. The city had the brittle blue of early spring. I watched people move through the revolving doors like a procession and thought, how many revolutions of glass did one need to forget a face? I had come to ask one simple question. Why? Why did she sign a document that could erase me? Why did she allow a durable power of attorney to be filed without my knowledge? The world, I thought naively, would be honest if you simply asked it to be. But the world is not honest. It is, like certain people, very clever at appearing ordinary while it arranges a theft. I had a conversation with a woman from the foundation that was all words and gentle pauses. She said, "Your daughter is saving you the trouble." She used the word help, a small bandage over a large wound. I wanted to laugh and then cry and then to say what I had thought in the privacy of nights. Did I not count as someone worth asking? I had, however, not yet been taught to fight. That hard lesson comes late for some people and never for others. For now I was learning to see. Every omission had its accomplices. Certain neighbors, certain lawyers, certain trustees, whose names meant little to me, but whose signatures could unravel a life. There were rumors of estate planning and consolidation, and like a schoolgirl eavesdropping on the grown-ups, my ears drank the words, trying to assemble a picture. The early rising action pressed in. Each whisper demanded a response. I was frightened and also, slowly, a little furious. Fury is a kind of fuel. I began to feel it in my fingertips. There was one more small thing I will tell you before the cliff hangs like a storm cloud. On the morning I found the photocopy. In the drawer, there was also a small key tied to a red ribbon. I held it up and the light caught its rust. It had been given to me years ago by my husband, the one who taught me how to plant beans in a pot and how to read the sky. He had told me then, with a grin, that some doors must remain closed until the right hands come. I had kept the key in the drawer like a promise. I now knew that keys were not just metal. They were decisions waiting to be made. Dumas once wrote that vengeance is a lesson taught by time. Perhaps he was right, or perhaps he was merely honest about human hearts. I can say this: time has a way of teaching you your place at the table, and sometimes it is not the one you believe you deserve. A moral aside lingers here, as if in the wings, because life is serious, and the stage must sometimes speak plain truth. When the world counts you as nothing, guard the towel of your dignity. When your name is redrawn by others, remember that paper may hold ink, but it cannot hold a life's worth of love. Justice, like a patient river, will sometimes find a way around the dam. I never expected what would be waiting for me at the gala, and then the door swung open. The door swung open, and the music from inside the gala folded me like a shawl I had not been meant to wear. Crystal chandeliers spilled their light, and men in tuxedos moved with the indifferent grace of moths. I thought for a foolish instant that perhaps I had stepped into someone else's life by mistake. My mason jar felt absurd in my coat pocket. The pearls lay against my throat like a prayer I kept whispering. I was small in that sea of formal gowns, but I carried an old woman's conviction, someone who has learned to count the turns of seasons and knows that patience is a weapon as much as it is a balm. The gala was a charity evening to celebrate the Foundation's community work, according to the glossy program printed with logos and smiling heads. My daughter's face was at the center of a pageant of acknowledgments. She moved like a conductor through the room, handing out smiles the way some people hand out business cards. Near the dais, Ms. Rafiq stood with a clipboard. H. Khan Investments had a table draped in a heavy cloth. A man with a neat mustache kept making notes that seemed to be for his own use. I would later learn that conspiracies are rarely dramatic. They are tidy, dotted with post-it notes and bank transfers. At the time, I simply followed the thread of what I knew. The photocopy in my drawer, the letter at my door that smelled faintly of perfume, the bank clerk's measured words. I moved slowly, deliberately, like an old clock. People parted around me with the curiosity of those who watch a relic being led to the stage. I pressed against that curiosity like a hand on a wick. I needed to get close enough to hear. It happened because I noticed a woman step away to take a call. She had the kind of phone voice I remembered from my daughter's university years, sudden softness, then steel. I edged closer and heard two names I had come to know: H. Khan Investments and Trust Consolidation. The woman's voice dropped to the kind of whisper only the rich believe is private. Yes, the durable power of attorney was effective. April 3rd, 2025, the trustee will assume authority as of May 1st. Will need the signed affidavit notarized. There were other words: liquidation, consolidate, minimize exposure. That felt like someone quietly moving furniture. While the house slept, I pressed my hand to my chest. I had seen betrayals before, the petty ones, the bitter ones, But this was a slow machinery of erasure. The micro cliffhanger came, a single beat that stopped my breath and moved me forward like a hand on a clock. I never expected who would speak next. The woman hung up and turned. She saw me and smiled with the practiced generosity of someone who assumes pity is a currency. "Oh, you must be Mrs. Riemann," she said, calling my name as if she had read the program. "Thank you for coming." My daughter crossed the room like a tide meeting a shore. Her eyes found me, and something flickered, perhaps a memory of once tender hands, before duty smoothed it. "Mother," she said, the word both an address and an instruction. "You shouldn't be here." There was a hush in her voice that made my ears ring. People glanced. My son, the one I had raised to tie his own shoelaces before kindergarten, had not been invited. The room's air smelled like a staging area. There are moments when the world shrinks to the size of a single room and you can hear the blood in your ears. I had arrived with nothing more than a mason jar and an old pair of pearls, and when I looked at my daughter, I felt the history between us as if it were a fabric tugged tight. "Why did you file that power of attorney?" I asked, willing the words to be calm. She sighed, and her sigh had the particular quality of a person who practices complexity. "It was for your convenience, Ma, so you wouldn't have to worry if anything happened." She said, "Convenience?" as if it were an explanation that could be folded into a napkin and put away. A cruel thing to do to the woman who had taught you how to iron a shirt. Around us, polite plates clinked. A man in a black suit tapped his glass to gain attention. The gala resumed its choreography. The woman from the foundation, Ms. Rafiq, handed me a card as if she were delivering a verdict disguised as information. "Ms. Raymond," she said, "our records show a durable power of attorney filed April 3rd, 2025, naming H. Khan Investments as agent. If there are questions, we have counsel." The leather of her folder made a soft sound like a moth beating itself to death. I left the gala with more than embarrassment. The night air hit my cheeks like cold iron. I walked the city streets carrying questions heavy as stones. The pearls felt heavier with each step, a necklace that had become a chain. The photocopy in my drawer haunted me. I could not stop thinking about the thin key tied to a red ribbon. That key, given to me by a man whose laugh smelled of tobacco and tomato soup, had been a promise. I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt its metal cool against my knuckles. I began to assemble allies with the clumsy, patient care of a woman who once mended socks with thread so thin you could not see it until it held. I called an old friend from church, Sophia, whose grandson now studied law. "It's complicated," Sophia said at first. She used the phrase the way some people use prayer, to delay action. But when I mentioned H. Khan Investments and the date April 3rd, her voice changed. "You should see a lawyer," she said at last. "There are ways to contest this, through probate court, through affidavits, through handwriting analysis." Handwriting analysis. The phrase felt like poetry. The idea that ink could tell the truth was comforting. I remembered teaching my daughter to write her name in a careful loop when she was small, the way we all start life, learning the shapes that will later be used against us. I called every place I could think of, gathering small facts. The bank clerk who remembered the file number, the notary who remembered the date and said he had just processed paperwork as requested. Each person's memory was a thread. Together they made a rope I could climb. There were setbacks. The first lawyer I met, a man with a tidy beard who seemed to measure his compassion in billable hours, said it would be difficult. "Power of attorney documents are ordinarily valid if properly executed," he warned. He used the word ordinarily like a safe. He required $1,500 up front to begin a challenge and talked about burdens of proof and clear and convincing evidence. I felt the sting of bank fees. I left his office with a list of steps and the feeling of being politely ushered into a queue. But then a young woman named Aisha answered my call. She was a paralegal at a small firm that handled elder law. Her voice was direct and quick. "Bring me the photocopy," she said. "Bring the bank notices. If there's anything that looks altered, we'll get a forensic document examiner," she added, almost as an afterthought. "We also subpoena bank records and look for IP logs. Emails, anything showing coercion. IP logs, emails. The world had its own ways of keeping secrets now. I felt like an old map, learning the marks of a new terrain. I was no longer content to sit by the window and count cars. I took the key from my pocket and used it like a small vow. The red ribbon had frayed. Its color had faded to the rust of memory. I went back to the apartment where I had once kept a box of old letters, where the house that had been mine had been changed on a list of paper and turned into a managed property with an account number. I arrived on a Tuesday at 10:30 a.m., a time that seems ordinary until it becomes the hour history chooses to change for you. Inside the flat, drawers had been emptied and rearranged. The photograph of my daughter at 5 had been moved. The small table where I kept my recipe cards was clear. Under the mattress, I found a torn envelope with the stamp of a notary. In the lining of a coat pocket, a receipt dated April 2nd for a courier service. Each tiny scrap was a breadcrumb. I held them as if they were relics and felt the past humming under my skin. Someone had been in my things. That sentence landed like a pebble and sent ripples. I brought everything to Aisha. She spread the papers across her desk like a detective laying out fingerprints in a novel. "This is better than nothing," she said, and her eyes were fierce. She promised handwriting analysis and said she would subpoena the notary's log for April 3rd, 2025. She would request CCTV footage from the building, and she would file an emergency petition to suspend the durable power of attorney pending investigation. She explained the legal standards, preponderance of the evidence, and clear and convincing proof. And I tried to keep my breath even as if legal jargon were medicine. Meanwhile, I kept pressing my own small investigations. I spoke to the neighbor who had dropped the letter at my door. He admitted that he had printed public records, something called articles of trust, that listed transfers totaling about $230,000. The amount had been moved to an account named H. Khan, Trust, Raymond Estate. Hearing the number aloud made my head swim. The digits transformed themselves into a future that had been quietly shifted away. $230,000. For some, it is a figure that builds neighborhoods. For me, it was a bundle of small repairs, possible medical bills, a lifetime's quiet. At night, I no longer relied on the sleeping pills as a sedative alone. They had become a small weapon against panic. I took them reluctantly, knowing they dulled my senses. The pills had been a companion for 20 years, friends in my night, but now they were a shroud tempting me to sleep through my own life. I began to take them less because I needed to be awake to gather the threads that might tighten into a net. I could not, in good conscience, hand myself over to a sleep that let others rearrange my world. The forensic report arrived on a Wednesday with the urgency of rain. Aisha handed me the printout, and I read like someone scanning a map. The handwriting expert, whose name was Dr. Latif, had compared the signature on the durable power of attorney to known samples. The report used polite, technical language. The questioned signature exhibits multiple characteristics inconsistent with the standard exemplars. Certain pen pressures, stroke formations, and connective patterns are not congruent with a genuine signature. Conclusion: the signature is likely not genuine. The words "not genuine" felt like a key turning in a lock. Aisha's eyes shone. "We have probable cause to believe forgery," she said. "That's something we can take to probate court and to the police. We can get a criminal complaint filed for forgery and possibly fraud. We can subpoena bank transfer records showing dates and IP addresses for the online initiations." She rattled off terms like a woman reciting recipes. Each ingredient a tool in building restraint. The legal path was clearer, but so was the danger. At a hearing the following Monday, the judge, stern with a balding crown, granted a temporary injunction suspending H. Khan Investments Authority pending further review. The courtroom smelled of disinfectant and old cases. For the first time since this began, I felt something like vindication course through me. The judge stamped the order. Temporary restraining order issued April 20th, 2025. The date stamped like a seal on my chest. But legal victories are like kindling. They must be guarded. The man with the neat mustache, Mr. Khan himself, I learned, was not a person to be dismissed. He came to the hearing like a general inspecting a parade. His presence was crisp and cautious. He smiled in a way that suggested he had read the script for this tragedy and could improvise. "We acted in good faith," his lawyers intoned. "All transfers were made in accordance with documented authorization." The word good faith rose like a cloth to mask a face, a moral aside midway. Here, Dumas style, because plot without reflection is like a banquet without bread. A man who believes himself beyond accountability is merely a man who has forgotten that tomorrow's ledger keeps a record of yesterday's sins. The story tightened. My daughter's calls slowed and then stopped. When she did call, her voice was distant, threaded with what sounded like counsel in the background. "Mother," she said once, "you don't understand. This is complicated." The word complicated again, an auditor's veil. I did understand. I had raised her on porridge and pneumonia, and complexity did not frighten me when it came with affection. Complexity only frightened me when it came with a ledger. One evening, Aisha handed me a subpoena return, a set of bank statements with IP logs and timestamps. The transfers flowed like numbers on a river. The crucial detail was small. A transfer attempt logged on April 2nd at 22:13 from an IP address registered to my daughter's home network. But the confirmation email to the trustee account was sent from a public address that morning had been traced to a courier's office. The transaction chain smelled like someone trying to hide steps behind steps. Then Aisha pointed to a note. The notary's log had been altered. There were 2 entries for April 3rd. 1. An original had been crossed out and replaced. The notary, under oath, said he had been misfiled and that someone had come back later with corrections. I sat there and felt the world shift beneath my feet. The documents were no longer abstractions. They were a map of intentionality. Proof was a cruel, honest thing. It hung over the courtroom like a lamp, and little by little lit faces. The micro cliffhanger, another single line beat, must be placed around 1,400 words. The recording began with my daughter's laugh. Yes, a recording. One of Sophia's contacts at the foundation, an administrator, had, by happenstance, recorded a meeting on May 1st where several parties discussed next steps if challenges arose. The recording, extracted from a phone backup, contained a conversation that was at once mundane and monstrous. I heard my daughter say, in a voice I could once have believed was warm, "If she becomes difficult, we have contingency plans. We can always manage things quietly." Her husband added, "We'll consult H. Khan. There are legal ways to minimize exposure." The phrase, "manage things quietly," had the chill of a scalpel. I pressed my hands to my mouth to keep the sound from breaking into the room. The courtroom seemed to swell. Jurors, where present, leaned forward as if they too had been waiting. The recording played again and again, each repetition like a bell tolling. The notary's alteration, the IP logs, the forged signature, the courier receipts. They braided together into a rope that tightened around pretense. Aisha filed motions. The police opened an investigation. The gala's glossy posters seemed to wrinkle at the edges, as if ashamed. H. Khan Investments sent a forceful letter denying wrongdoing and alleging malicious interference. My daughter hired counsel that smelled of expense and polished phrases. The battle sharpened. Before the final confrontation, another moral aside is needed. Brief, elevated, Dumas-like. Fate is not a blind referee. It is a ledger keeper with a patient pen. Those who think to write the stories of others are often surprised when ink returns to ask for an accounting. I was tired and yet strangely awake. I had never expected to be a figure in a courtroom drama at my age. But there I was, pearl clasp at my throat, hands steady, because when the world writes you out, you must, if you can, write yourself back in. The moment of turning was at hand. The evidence was stacked, the judge had issued temporary injunctions, the police had interviews scheduled. I could feel the axis of my life tilting back toward me. Then, at the height of the case, when affidavits were sworn and witnesses called, I opened a small locked box that my husband had left me years ago and had told me to open only in a time of need. I had found the key in part 1 and kept it like a secret. Inside the box, beneath a moth-eaten shawl, was a packet, an original last will and testament dated January 15, 2018, in my daughter's hand. leaving me a modest home and calling for the preservation of family heirlooms, including the pearls. The will bore a signature I recognized as hers, clean, deliberate, as she used in birthdays before the world taught her to sign in contracts, and it bore the stamp of a notary different from the one who had corrected the April 3rd log. The will's existence was a thing I had never expected as a weapon or as comfort. It was a relic of a promise made in ink and witnessed. I felt something inside me, call it relief, call it vindication, bloom like a bruised rose. The will and the forensic report together were the fulcrum. The climax had arrived. I could see it as a single impossible beam of light. I signed an affidavit declaring the will's authenticity and handed the packet to Aisha to file with the court. I walked into the hearing the next morning with that packet under my arm like armor. The judge read, eyebrows knitting. The room held its breath the way a lung holds breath before a plunge. I rose to speak because there are moments when silence is complicity, and I had no stomach for being complicit. I told the court about the mason jar, about the pearls, about April 3rd and the photocopy, about sleeping pills and the nights they had softened. I told them the truth in the plain language of someone who had lived through small mercies and great cruelties. My voice, when I began, trembled. It steadied as I continued. I felt my daughter's eyes on me, open, wide, as if she had not expected I would know how to fight. The judge looked at the will. The clerk compared stamps. The notary who had later corrected the log was called and under oath admitted to a mistake. Under further questioning, his hand shook. The IP logs were matched. A chain of emails showed coordination with HCON Investments. The evidence was, as Aisha had said, a rope that tightened. Then my daughter stood. Her face was pale, but there was an engineer's resolve behind the pallor. For a moment I thought she might apologize. Instead, she spoke with the kind of clarity that comes from being backed to a corner. "Mother," she said, voice even, "you think you know everything." There was no apology in those words. There was a challenge. The room held a thin line between judgment and spectacle. I felt then the real test of the turning point. Would I remain the woman who forgave too much, who folded herself small to keep the family whole? Or would I be the woman who let justice, not vengeance, reclaim what was rightly hers? There is a thin difference, and Dumas would agree. Justice becomes noble when it is chosen, not merely when it is served. I chose. I chose to fight. The city's afternoon light sloped across the courthouse steps as if painting a stage. My hands were not the frantic hands of someone making a scene. They were the steady hands of one who has learned to wait. I had the will, the forensic report, the bank statements, the recording, and the notary's admission. The scales tilted, and yet, even as the judge leaned toward a tentative ruling, a noise snapped across the room. A shout, a muffled commotion at the back, like someone dropping a curtain. People turned. My daughter's counsel whispered urgently, and then two uniformed men moved toward the entrance. My stomach folded like paper. I did not understand, not yet. The uniformed men were not police. They were private security with badges from HCON Investments. They had come in like a sudden wind to claim a document, an attempt to remove evidence under the guise of company property. The courtroom erupted, and the judge slammed his gavel. Everything could unravel in a single breath. I gripped the packet lower, the paper warm as if it kept my pulse. The final micro cliffhanger must hang here. A single line to carry the reader into part 3. Someone was reaching for the packet. Someone's hand closed over the packet. For a second, the world contracted. To the skin between two palms and the sound of my heart. The man with the neat mustache, Mr. Khan, had sent his security like a gust to snatch a sheet of paper. The uniformed men's fingers brushed the corner of the will, and I felt suddenly very old and very fierce. The courtroom erupted into a clamor that smelled of wet coats and alarmed feathers. The judge barked a command, and the security men froze, like birds caught in stage light. The judge's gavel came down, and time, which had been a patient teacher, decided to act. My packet stayed in my hands. There are moments in life when you must step into the center of the stage, not because you wish applause, but because silence would be a crime. I looked at my daughter, and in that gaze there was both recognition and a strange, cold distance. She had thought she could manage things quietly. She had not counted on voices outside the rooms she controlled. The recording, the notary's admission, the forensic report, all of them had become more than paper. They had become witnesses. "Order," the judge said, and then softer. "Mrs. Raymond, do you wish to make a statement?" I had stood to speak because I had prepared myself to do so. Preparation is different from hatred. It is a discipline. I told the court what I had told Aisha and Sophia in smaller rooms, that my life had been bricks laid one small kindness at a time, that the mason jar contained not just coins, but afternoons saved to take a bus to the doctor, that the pearls had been my mother's and meant, like all heirlooms, to remind us of a continuity beyond transactions. There was a hush, like the first snowfall. The judge's temporary restraining order, issued April 20th, 2025, remained in place, but something more began to happen. The police, called because private security had attempted a removal, arrived and took statements. The prosecutor, who had been watching from the gallery with a file, leaned forward and agreed to open a criminal investigation into the possible forgery and fraud. When law and conscience find each other, they make a dangerous pair for those who believe themselves untouchable. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Sophia, small, steady, with a church-based voice that had comforted my friends' funerals and cake recipes alike. She squeezed my shoulder as if to say that old hands could still be useful. Aisha caught my eye and gave me a smile that tasted of victory and exhaustion. The young law students who had sat in, because Aisha had asked them to help with subpoenas, now rose like a small army. The city, which had seemed to have rearranged itself to accommodate certain people, began to see the cracks. Outside the courthouse, the press, who adored scandal, had started to sniff. The headline that would later run in a few papers the next morning read in generous language, "Philanthropy and paper, trustee on trial?" I do not crave headlines. The camera's flash is like cold rain, but I will admit that on that day I felt something like a cloak of dignity wrap around me. I had, in small increments, become a person with a claim. Still, the falling action required patience, not triumph. Proof is hollow if it does not find a home in law and in conscience. The notary backtracks, Mr. Khan's firm-faced inquiries, and my daughter's counsel argued threads of good faith and miscommunication. They pushed, legally, and they pushed in the public relations rooms, letters, statements, glossy denials. "We acted properly," their spokesperson said, with the unhelpful grace of someone arranging curtains to hide a wall. It is astonishing how often words can be arranged to placate while they protect. I did not sleep much those nights. The sleeping pills that had been a companion for 20 years, prescribed to quiet the nights after pneumonia, after storms, after husbands' absences, lost their seductive ease. I had taken them because they dulled the worry, but in the mornings they left me foggy and slow, unable to gather threads. During the court fight, I took them less, because I needed my mind clear. There is a certain courage in choosing wakefulness over the comfort of forgetfulness. It felt like stepping out into a cold morning to plant beans you hope will sprout. Micro cliffhanger number 2. I stopped taking them altogether. I woke earlier and learned the city's sounds, the tram's bell, the vendor who sold samosas like new stitches in a sweater. Being awake meant I could pace and think, call witnesses, and remember recipes and dates. It was harder, yes, but it felt honest. Aisha brought more documents, bank acknowledgments, transfer records with timestamps, and an email thread that showed coordination between a foundation administrator and HCON Investments, dated April 2nd and 3rd. Each new paper was a footstep leading back to accountability. The prosecutor, who had been reticent at first, took the case seriously when he saw the chain of events. "Forgery is a criminal act," he said. "If we can show intent to defraud, transfers initiated under false pretenses, then we have grounds." The words, "intent to defraud," are heavy. They carry a weight that is not easily lifted by public relations. Mr. Khan's team argued that the transfers were authorized. My daughter's team argued that she had been trying to simplify management. Simplify, in their mouth, had the chill of erasure. At a hearing on May 18th, 2025, things shifted again. The judge, Stern, the man who had stamped the temporary restraining order, was not an idealist. He was a magistrate who respected the clarity of evidence. He demanded production of CCTV footage from the Courier office and requested a full forensic audit of HCON Investments accounts. His clerks worked like bees. The world, which had been moving with syrupy politeness to help certain actors, now moved with the briskness of someone cleaning a table before guests arrive. A witness came forward. He was the courier, a man named Raza, with a hand calloused from parcels and an honest face. He had been nervous at first, but then grown steadier when Aisha reassured him. Under oath, he said that on April 2nd, he had delivered a package to my daughter's address, a packet he had been told was time-sensitive and to be handled personally. He later recalled seeing a second person there, a representative from HCON Investments, who signed a receipt. It was ordinary then, he said. Just a delivery. I didn't know it would be this. His voice trembled with the small guilt of a man who had touched the edges of something bigger than he suspected. Raza's testimony fit into the quilt we were piecing together. Courier receipts. IP logs from April 2nd at 22:13, an altered notary log, and a recording hinting at contingency plans. The web had a spider at its center. The prosecutor's office moved to present the case to a grand jury for potential criminal charges of forgery and conspiracy to commit fraud. For the first time, I felt the tip of justice like a needle drawing a pattern. Yet the turning from suspicion to consequence requires that the human heart be confronted too. In private meetings, my daughter's expressions changed. First denial, then avoidance, then the brittle, practiced calm of someone who has rehearsed 1,000 lines. She sat in the gallery like an actress waiting for her cue. Once, when our eyes met across a corridor, I asked simply, "Why?" She looked away. I wondered if she had forgotten the nights I had held her when she was small, the soup I had fed her when fever came. Or perhaps she had simply calculated that those nights were part of a ledger she no longer needed. A moral aside here, soft, Dumas-toned, because men who believe themselves above account often forget the small things that shape a soul. Wealth may teach people new manners, but it seldom rewrites an old conscience. The only ledger that truly matters keeps track of what we do when no one watches. The public scrutiny did what gossip never could. It made sponsors uneasy. Donors who had once lined the foundation's list with generous checks began to reevaluate. A few quietly withdrew commitments. A board member stepped down for personal reasons. Money, which had seemed like a shield, turned out to be as brittle as any plaster when its underpinnings are examined. HCON Investments found itself besieged by auditors. The firm's chairman, a man who had enjoyed the ease of being unquestioned, resigned abruptly. Pride is a spectacle when it falls. My daughter's foundation announced her suspension. They issued a terse statement. Effective May 25, 2025. Ms. Raymond has been suspended pending further investigation. The press framed it as a fall from grace. There was, in the suspension, a kind of public humiliation. The gala photos were now read in a new light. The program brochures, preserved like fossils, seemed to mock the performance. The man with the neat mustache called a press conference and attempted a refined denial. But who can deny truth when the truth is recorded in emails and timestamps and the log of a notary with shaking hands? There were bitter days. My daughter sent a message, short, formal. I regret the hurt. She did not say the words that would have mended things. I am sorry, Mother, and perhaps she could not. Words that are safe in the mouth of counsel often fail in the place where hearts can be reached. I grieved for the daughter I had raised and for the woman who had chosen expediency over affection. But grief is not a substitute for justice. The court process moved toward resolution. The grand jury, after weeks of consideration, returned an indictment on charges of forgery and conspiracy for the notary and a senior executive at HCON Investments. HCON itself faced regulatory fines and criminal inquiry. My daughter was not indicted criminally. Her counsel had skillfully navigated the edges, but civil suits loomed. The will I had found in the locked box, the one dated January 15, 2018, was recognized by the probate court as the decider of intent. It expressly left me the modest house where I had kept my recipe cards and called for the preservation of heirlooms, including the pearls. The judge ruled in my favor. On June 10, 2025, the judge issued a declaratory judgment in probate court restoring certain property to me and ordering HCON Investments to return funds improperly transferred, amounting to approximately $230,000, pending accounting. The order used crisp language. The court finds sufficient evidence to nullify transfers initiated under the challenged power of attorney and orders restitution where appropriate. The decision did more than move papers. It moved people's lives back toward an old axis. The return of funds would mean repairs for my roof, perhaps a small trip I had whispered about, and the freedom to sleep without counting coins. When restitution began, when checks were written, when accounts were adjusted, I felt relief like a hand taking a weight from my chest. The pearls returned to their place around my throat as if they had been waiting, patient and knowing. The mason jar, which I had kept at the bedside through nights thick with pills and thought, became a new vessel, not only for coins, but for letters I now wrote to neighbors who had once been indifferent. I changed my doctor's prescription, not out of drama, but out of principle. I had been taking sleeping pills for 20 years. Now I wanted to learn again the rhythm of my own nights. I replaced them slowly, with tea, with a companionable radio, with walks that tasted of morning. But poetic justice demanded a final flourish. The notary and the executive faced criminal consequences. They pled guilty to charges in a negotiated settlement that included restitution and public apologies. HCON Investments paid fines and was forced to relinquish management of certain trustee accounts. The foundation, shamed by headlines and donor exoduses, restructured its board and appointed an independent oversight committee. My daughter resigned from her role on the foundation and in the months to come agreed to mediation, civil steps that required her to account for certain decisions and to return monies where necessary. Her public humiliation was private sorrow amplified. Interviews with her showed a woman who had once been a daughter, now standing before a crowd as a figure diminished by choices. She called me once more. It was late in July when she came to the small house the court had ordered returned to me. She stood at the gate like a visitor unsure of the rules. Her eyes were tired. She clasped my hands and said, haltingly, "I thought I was doing the right thing." The sentence was both confession and defense. I listened and felt the old mother's ache, the instinct to cover, to soothe, to explain away. Yet I had also become a different woman, one who had learned that forgiveness is a choice and not always immediate. "I know you thought many things," I said, "but thought is not an excuse. Actions are the things that build a life." I did not demand that she take back every wrong because the law had done some of that work. Instead, I asked for small human things, an apology for my grandchildren's birthdays missed, an acknowledgement of the nights I had sat up praying for her, and modest, almost childish, a willingness to help me with the plumbing one afternoon. She agreed, awkwardly, and there was a small, fragile beginning, a Dumas-like moral aside before the final knot. Vengeance wears itself thin when it is pure rage. Justice, when tempered with mercy, becomes a light that shows the way forward. To reclaim dignity is not merely to punish, it is to restore the shape of the heart. In the aftermath, life relearned its rhythms. The mason jar of coins stayed where it belonged on the shelf, no longer a hiding place for the last measure of winter bread, but a symbol of my insistence. I repaired the chipped mug, this time not with frantic glue, but with a craftsman who rewired the crack with gold in the Japanese method of kintsugi. And I thought how apt that was, to make something whole by honoring its breaks. The pearls, shining against my throat in the morning light, had a new story, not of loss, but of return. The sleeping pills receded from my life like a tide pulling shells away. I developed new rituals, warm milk with cardamom before bed, a radio show that read poetry, the slow folding of laundry at dusk. I still felt the scar of betrayal, a neat line I traced with my thumb now and then, but it did not define me. I had regained not only the house and the money, but the stubborn joy of being myself without apology. My daughter's life transformed too. less in the public spectacle and more in the quiet corners. She took therapy, as her counsel suggested, and volunteered in small measures where she could find redemption, not from headlines, but from hands. The restitution she signed and the community work she did were not salvation. They were steps. People change in small increments, sometimes painfully slow. I forgave in stages. Forgiveness, like building a chair, requires the fitting of each piece until the whole can hold a body. The moral resolution is simple yet old. Truth gathers like a river, slow and patient, and finds its way around the dam. Those who try to divert its course must be prepared for the consequences of engineered currents. I learned, and teach now in small, neighborly ways, that dignity is not a thing given by others. It is a habit you keep by how you carry your days. The house is modest. I have a garden where I plant beans in the spring and roses in the autumn because they seem rebelliously cheerful. I buy small gifts for my grandchildren, not with the weight of restitution, but with the lightness of a woman who knows how to be content. I keep the mason jar on the windowsill, not as a relic, but as a promise, that I will always keep something saved for the unexpected, and that small sacrifices can accumulate into a life. If my story touched you, if the thought of a life rearranged by other people made your chest tighten, then perhaps share it with someone who needs courage today. If you have been pushed aside, remember that paper does not have the last word. Signatures and seals can be challenged. Keep your records, guard your keys, and learn the names of the people who watch your affairs. Most of all, wake up. Life is better lived with eyes open, even when the nights have been long. If you want more stories like this, stories of small people who stand up to great wrongs, of mothers who find their voices late in life, of pearls that return to the neck, subscribe. Leave a comment and tell me your own truth. This old heart has many more truths yet to tell.